Professor Kassow is the author of Students, Professors, and the State in Tsarist Russia, also co-editor of Between Tsar and People. His most recent book is Who Will Write Our History? Rediscovering a Hidden Archive from the Warsaw Ghetto. Has been involved, had many fellowships, IREX, Fulbright, Woodrow Wilson, and so on. He's a consultant at the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. He's a child of Holocaust survivors. Really, we're so honored that you're here, Professor Kassow. Join me in welcoming Professor Sam Kassow.
Thank you. Es ist ein Vergnügen zu sein da. Ich wollte gerade mit euch finish mit dem Rest der Vergnügen, aber ich meine, als sagt, man kann nicht Mama lassen. So I'll switch over to English. Thank you for inviting me here, and it's a pleasure to see some old friends. I remember first meeting Costa Gebert back in 1985, if I'm not mistaken, a different world, a different place. And thank you, Madam Consul, for coming here. When we think of Polish Jewry today, we think of it in terms of death. We think of it in terms of destruction. Kids who go on March of the Living tend to go to different concentration camps. I've been involved in this Museum of Polish Jewish History, which will open, God willing, in Warsaw in October. And one of the aims of this Museum of Polish Jewish History is to remind us that Poland was not just a place of death, but Poland was a place where Jews flourished, where 8-9 centuries of Jewish history took place. On the one hand, we have books on pre-war Polish Jewry with titles such as On the Edge of Destruction, No Way Out, Auf den Rand von Abgrund. But on the other hand, we have to remember that as late as 1934, one of the leaders of Polish Jewry, Senator Aleksiun, said American Jews might be better off economically and Soviet Jews might have better chances at education, but the fact is that for all that, there's only one Jewish community in the world that can provide spiritual and cultural leadership for the Jewish people, and that's Polish Jewry. So that doesn't sound like a community that's on the edge of destruction. It was beleaguered, it was facing terrible problems, but it was not on the edge of destruction from its own subjective point of view. The Jews have deep ties to Poland, and we could see those deep ties in some of the legends that Jews like to tell about when they came to Poland. That when the first Jews arrived in Poland, can you all hear me here? Yeah. When the first Jews arrived in Poland, on the bark of the trees were emblazoned the Hebrew letters Polin, here you will rest. And Polin is also the Hebrew word for Poland. There is also a legend that, and we see this in Shalom Ash's Kiddush Hashem, that when Noah released the dove and the world was covered with water, Hashem, God, laid out huge palm fronds on the water so the dove could have a place to rest when he got tired. And likewise, when the Jews began their trek through the diaspora, God laid out a huge palm frond in the diaspora so Jews could rest and even prosper. And that palm frond was Poland. There are many more legends, the legends of Esther, the Jewish girl with whom Kazimierz Wielki, Casimir the Great, fell in love. And in the Zechus of Esther, Kazimierz Wielki supposedly gave the Jews a charter promising them autonomy and liberty on the Polish lands. Obvious parallels to Queen Esther in the Megillah. Polish nationalists also had a version of that legend, but in that legend, Esterka, a wily Żydówka, took this honest, God-fearing, but not very cynical Christian man, Kazimierz, and in the pay of the Jews, she wound him around her little finger, and because of this, he sold Poland to the Jews lock, stock, and barrel. But the fact is that even if we look at demography, even if we look at population, we see some incredible statistics. In 1500, on the lands of what was then Crown Poland and then Lithuania, there were about 30,000 Jews total. Number of Jews that live in the greater Hartford area. By 1765, there were close to 1 million. And then, of course, Poland was partitioned. Poland disappeared from the map. But on those same Polish lands, by 1900, there were about 7 million. And we're not counting the Jews who emigrated to the United States. And if we look at this from another way, in 1650, world Jewry was divided 50-50 between Ashkenazim and non-Ashkenazim. By 1900, world Jewry was 90% Ashkenazi. And this was in large part because of the incredible demographic revolution which took place in Eastern Europe, which, after all, were the lands, for the most part, of the Polish Commonwealth. And the Jews of Hungary, the Jews of Bukovina, the Jews who migrated south, they came originally from Poland. The vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews today, over 90%, have descendants who once lived in the Polish lands. And Poland gave us incredible gifts. The symbiosis of the Polish nobility and the Jews, which was not always smooth, and things were not always totally rosy, and there were massacres, and there were persecutions, and there were blood libels, and so on. But nevertheless, that symbiosis of the Polish nobility and the Jews gave us a number of very important factors which helped change the course of Jewish history. One of that was a new kind of Jewish settlement called the shtetl, or miasteczka in Polish. The shtetl never existed anywhere else in the diaspora, never in Babylonia, Egypt, Spain. The shtetl was largely founded by the nobility as a company town to attract Jews. Most shtetl, especially in the eastern part of the Commonwealth, had Jewish majorities. Instead of just living in one street, as elsewhere in the diaspora, one region, Jews lived in the whole town. Jews spoke a different language. In the shtetl, Jews could see themselves as a majority, not a minority, living in Jewish space and living to some degree in Jewish time. We also, in Poland, saw the development of the Yiddish language. In Poland, we saw the development of far-reaching autonomy based on the Council of the Four Lands, where Jewish law was adapted to meet changing circumstances. And we could go on, but you get the picture. Poland was not just a place of death. Poland was a very, very critical factor in Jewish history. Now, for hundreds of years, Poles and Jews lived together and apart. They were familiar strangers. One Jew writing his autobiography in Sweden after the war entitled his autobiography Mój obcy kraj, my foreign native country. Poles and Jews were divided by religion, obviously, largely by occupation. Except in Galicia, Jews hardly farmed. Poles were largely an agricultural people. Jews were largely urban. There were attitudes which underscored a certain degree of mutual suspicion, leavened by familiarity. Many of these attitudes had their roots in the peasantry, in their suspicion of strangers, in their suspicion of people who didn't work the land. The Polish nobility, on the one hand, needed Jews. On the other hand, there was a certain element of contempt and condescension in their attitude towards Jews. Jews were seen as a caste, never able to become equal. But within the mindset of the Polish nobility, at least until the end of the 19th century, Jews were part of the woodwork. Jews were part of the landscape. They belonged here. They might not be our social equals, but they belonged. And for a very long time, and this is very important to remember as well, when we speak of the Polish nation, I think this is true until the latter part of the 19th century, we can't really include the peasantry, who are the majority of the Polish nation. We really have to talk about the nobility. And the nobility revolted against the Russians. The nobles led revolts against the Russians in 1830, 1831. The revolt in 1863, where many young idealistic Jews participated and which has been immortalized in Polish literature and Polish art, such as Alexander Lesser. 1863, where Jews and Poles fought together against the Russians, what came to be known in Polish as the zbratania, as the brotherhood, the slogan of kochajmy się, let us love each other. And this was seen as a high point of Polish-Jewish rapprochement. And generations later, Jews would constantly refer back to 1863. Emanuel Ringelblum, Olaf Hasholem, who was arrested by the Gestapo 70 years ago yesterday, Professors Magruder, and others. Can you all hear me? Okay. But after the defeat of the insurrection of 1863, there was this general sense that we can't beat our heads against the wall on the part of the Poles. We can't just revolt. We have to adopt another strategy for conserving our nation under foreign occupation. And one of these strategies, of course, was to expand the nation. That the Polish nation should now include the peasants. It should include the workers. And for many of these Poles who are now trying to think outside the box, the Polish nation should also include the Jews. And one of these strategies for building and preserving and saving the Polish nation was Polish positivism. Like the Czechs, who are taking back their territory little by little, we have to change our strategy and build from the bottom up. Schools, we have to build an economy, we have to build Polish places of business, we have to develop a Polish middle class. We have to stop revolting and we have to start creating an organic nation that's economically and socially viable. And in this vision of a Poland built from the ground up, there was a place for the Jews. The Jews would help build Poland through their energy, through their money, through their talent, through their love of education. And it was taken as a matter of course. It was taken as a given that in return, the Jews would adopt Polish culture. It was taken as a given by many of these broad-minded, well-meaning Polish liberals and writers like Świętochowski and Orzeszkowa, that of course the Jews would prefer Polish culture, and of course their own culture based on tradition and this ugly jargon called Yiddish was inferior. Now, that vision of Jewish integration into Poland found a enthusiastic response among some Jews, among the Jewish upper middle class. They embraced this. They built the Tlamackie synagogue in Warsaw, which is going to be a symbol of Polish Jewish integration, where Jews would be Poles of the Mosaic persuasion, Polish in every respect except religion. The temple in Krakow, the Synagoga Postępowa in Lvov, all this showed an optimism that Jews and Poles could live together in concord. And also a belief that this integration would eventually persuade the Hasidic masses, steeped in this mumbo-jumbo of tradition and orthodoxy, to see the light and to become, as well, good patriotic Poles. But unfortunately, it was not to be. It was not to be for many, many reasons, some having to do with changes in European culture in the late 19th century, some having to do with the fact that Polish positivism was foreign to many Poles. It was foreign to the ethos of the nobility. It was foreign to the ethos of the Catholic Church, seen as too materialistic. It was foreign to the ethos of the emerging Polish socialist movement. in its rejection of battle and struggle, and instead this emerging Polish nationalism, which was necessary and which was inevitable, took another direction. And the direction of this emerging Polish nationalism veered away from integration, and it went towards an ideology called national democracy. And one of its main ideologues was Roman Dmowski, who's considered one of the great heroes of modern Poland. If you go to Warsaw, there's a big roundabout rondo named after Dmowski. Dmowski is considered a heavy hitter in Polish history. Now, Dmowski also pushed this idea that the Polish nation has to include everybody, has to include all Poles. But he emphasized the Jews cannot be Poles. And he believed that the Polish people have to develop a sense of national egotism, that nice guys finish last in the game of building and protecting nations. The Poles have to be merciless when it comes to protecting their national interest. And in the eyes of Dmowski, the Jews were the fourth partition. There were three partitions, the Prussians, the Habsburgs, and the Russians. But the Jews were the fourth partition, and they were the most dangerous. They were the most dangerous because they controlled the economy, they controlled the cities, they kept the Poles from developing their own middle class, and even more so, the Jews had a different psychology. And that Jewish psychology was so powerful, so strong, so cunning, that perhaps the most dangerous Jews of all were the Jews who spoke Polish and wanted to be part of the Polish nation, because they posed the danger of subverting Polishness from within. Now, this in and of itself would have been very, very unfavorable for the Jews. But it was coupled with a simultaneous development on the Jewish street. As Polish nationalism was moving away from inclusive integration and towards a nationalism which was exclusive, Jews themselves were developing a national identity which said, we're Jewish, we're not Polish. Yitzhak Lebush Peretz in Warsaw said, what? We're chopped liver, we have to be ashamed of the Yiddish language, we have to crawl down and bow to the Poles, we have to apologize for who we are. The rise of a Yiddish press, the rise of Warsaw as a center of Hebrew publishing, the rise of new movements like Zionism and the Bund, the immigration into Warsaw and Łódź of more than 150,000 Litvaks, Jews from the Pale of Settlement, who had a different psychology, who were very Jewish, but who were alienated from Polish culture. All this had an impact on the transformation of Jews themselves. Jews became more Jewish, and this idea of being Polish wannabes started to lose currency very, very quickly. This growing alienation between Jews and Poles was also exacerbated by quote-unquote democracy. Now, what do I mean by that? Our former president, George W. Bush, believed that democracy is a cure-all. Democracy leads to happiness and it leads to stability. The problem is that sometimes, especially in multi-ethnic areas, and especially when you have a tradition of suspicion or emerging suspicion between peoples, the trappings of democracy, elections, a mass press, lead to ethnic strife. And this is what happened in Poland after 1905. In the Russian partition, a Duma with flawed but nevertheless real elections. In the Habsburg Empire, an expansion of the electoral law meant that Poles and Jews within mass politics, within the mass press, now began to see each other even more as rivals, as different peoples. Don't let the Jews get this seat. Don't let the Poles take this away from us. And this led to escalating Polish-Jewish tensions, culminating in 1912 in a boycott of Jewish businesses proclaimed by the National Democrats, because they believed that the Jews were not letting the Poles decide who would represent Polish Warsaw in the Russian Duma. Does this all make sense? Following me so far? Now, in this escalating alienation between Jews and Poles, what happened to what we would call Polish moderate liberal Democrats? What happened to the kind of people that we would recognize as tolerant liberals? For a long time, they fought to make Polish public opinion more tolerant. But many of them themselves felt betrayed by the Jews. People like Alexander Świętochowski says, I wanted the Jews to have equal rights as long as they wanted to be Poles. But now that they want to be Jews, I can't have a foreign nation being a majority in our cities and not caring about our own nation, our own culture. So one of the things that happened is that the Jewish question attenuated and weakened what might have been a very strong trend of Polish liberal democracy. And instead, much of Polish nationalism became very intolerant. Now, in 1918, after the destruction of World War I, which leveled the Polish economy and the battles went back and forth over Polish territory, Poland finally became, once again, an independent state. And for the Poles, this was a wonderful, wonderful time. They regained their independence after 125 years, but it was bittersweet. They had to fight on every border. They had to fight against the Germans, against the Czechs, against the Ukrainians, against the Bolsheviks, against the Lithuanians. Every border was in dispute. The state took time getting organized. The army was a pickup job. Discipline was not very well established. There was a great deal of chaos. And to make a long story short, what the Poles remember as a heroic period for them, their heroic battle to rebuild their country, to proclaim their independence, to protect their new borders, the Jews remember very differently. They remember pogroms. They remember the pogrom in Lvov in November 1918. They remember when a Polish officer barges in on a Jewish relief meeting in Pinsk in April 1919 and executes 35 Jews because he thinks they're communists. They remember the day that the Polish army, quote-unquote, liberated Vilna, and a pogrom ensued where 55 Jews were killed. Now, the Polish central government had no hand in planning these pogroms. They didn't want them because at the same time Poland's fate was being decided in Versailles. This didn't make Poland look very good. And in fact, it led to demands for the minority treaties to defend minority rights, which the Poles resented. But the fact remained that the very birth of the Polish state reiterated and underscored this chasm between Poles and Jews. Now, that said, there were many Jews who believed that this was a glitch, that the anti-Semitism was a glitch, that once Poland stabilized, and once the external threat receded, and once the economy was rebuilt, Polish-Jewish relations would go back to normal. And the Jewish idea of normal, at least in the minds of many of these Jews, was the normality of the Commonwealth. A state that was tolerant, that was liberal, that was humane, the kind of state that produced Adam Mickiewicz, the kind of state that produced Słowacki, the kind of Commonwealth that allowed people to live their own lives. And so the sense was that the real Poland will eventually resurface. You just have to give it time. By 1921, Poland had indeed entered a new stage of stabilization. Poland now became a republic. There was a constitution which promised civil rights and civil equality to everybody. But the fact was that the Jews in this interwar Poland, in many respects, were second-class citizens. They could vote. There was relative liberty of the press, although censorship became a problem. Jews could develop their own culture in ways that they couldn't in the Soviet Union, but they were second-class citizens. Now, what we see in interwar Poland rather than say, oh my God, this shows the Poles are bad and they're terrible and they're oppressors, we should look at this in a more nuanced way. And we should see that there is an innate tension between professions of democracy and equality for all citizens and professions of an ethnic nation state, where the state is created for a particular people. Now, no one has ever accused me of being any less than very pro-Israel, and I am in constant battle with my colleagues who want to boycott Israel. And I understand the logic of a Jewish state, and I understand why a people needs a state of its own, why a people has a right to defend itself. However, the fact is that there has been a tension in Israel between the needs of Israel as a Jewish state and the aspiration to give real equality to everybody, including non-Jews. It's a problem. Let's not deny it. And that problem becomes even worse when resources are very tight. And in a sense, this was a factor. This was not the factor, but this was a factor in understanding Polish-Jewish relations in interwar Poland. Interwar Poland was 60% Polish, 40% minority. Ukrainians, Germans, Belarusians, Jews. Jews were 10% of the population. They were 30 to 50% of the urban population in many of the regions. In the east, they were sometimes 80% of the urban population. The Ukrainians and the Germans were a real threat to the Polish state. They had territorial aspirations. The Jews were not a threat to the Polish state, but in the tradition of national democracy, they were seen as an element which hindered the healthy development of the Polish urban class, of the Polish middle class. And the Polish economy in the interwar Poland never got off the ground. The wartime destruction was followed by inflation. And then that was followed by 2 good years, 26, 27, which in turn was followed by the Depression, which for an agricultural country like Poland began not in 1929, but in 1928. And the Depression lasted right up until 1936. And so the Polish economy never really got going. Resources were never ample. Perhaps had the Polish economy boomed in the 20s and 30s, and had someone like Pilsudski lived to be 100, things might have been different. But as they say in Yiddish, okay, I won't repeat that. Something to do with the Bubba and the Zeta. So interwar Poland went through 3 different periods. And again, I'm not trying to present this talk in terms of saying that a particular people is good and a particular people is a victim. Just trying to explain what happened. The first period was parliamentary democracy, 1921 to 1926. Polish governments were dominated by a coalition largely of the nationalists, the Index, and the Peasant Party. But the Index were anti-Semitic. The peasants also anti-Semitic in their own way. That is, they believed that Jews should emigrate from Poland. They saw Jews as exploiters in the villages. Although later on, the peasants began to moderate their views in the late 30s. But the one political party in the Polish parliament that fought anti-Semitism was the PPS, or the Polish Socialist Party. There was also the Stronnictwo Demokratyczne, but they were tiny. The PPS fought anti-Semitism, but at the same time, it was not overly sensitive to many Jewish concerns. For example, it also favored Sunday as a day of obligatory rest, which hurt many Sabbath-observant Jews. But during this time of parliamentary democracy, the Jews believed that they were discriminated against and suffered a great deal. The state took over large branches of the economy, like tobacco and alcohol. And once the state took over an economic branch, established a monopoly, Jews were fired. Jews were not in state and municipal service. Jews were 10% of the population. In the city of Warsaw, there were less than 1% of the municipal employees. The tax policy of the Polish government was seen by Jews as totally discriminatory, where Jews paid a much higher proportion of taxes, about 40% of total taxes, even though they were 10% of the population. Jews believed that the Polish government violated their promises to give financial support to Jewish schools and to Jewish institutions. In the late 1930s, when the Polish government accelerated its modernization of the economy, Jews were basically frozen out. Jews, therefore, saw this as a policy of systemic economic discrimination. Polish historians, including those who one would never accuse of anti-Semitism, like Jerzy Tomaszewski, say it's not so much anti-Semitism, it's the fact that Poland was a poor country, it faced terrible economic problems, and the strategy the Polish government pursued was a rational strategy, given the fact that the agrarian sector was even poorer than the urban sector. Things got better for Jews when democracy was superseded by an authoritarian semi-dictatorship in 1926. Joseph Pilsudski takes power, and from 1926 to 1935, Jews feel better. They're not better off economically because of the Depression, but they feel that Pilsudski is a decent leader who has no tolerance for anti-Semitism. Now, Pilsudski did not openly embrace Jews. He didn't go with Chabad rabbis to light Hanukkah menorahs in Warsaw. But he fought anti-Semitism. He did not allow anti-Semitic violence. You might say that Pilsudski was anti-Semitic. And he did some things that were good for Jews, like finally extending citizenship to many doubtful cases, like finally expunging from the law books pre-partition laws that discriminated against Jews. But Pilsudski dies in 1935. And from 1935 to 1939, we could see this as perhaps one of the worst periods in modern Polish-Jewish relations. Pilsudski's successors didn't have his charisma. They didn't have his authority. And they were always looking over their shoulders at the nationalist right. And they understood that the nationalist right was getting more and more headway and more energy from anti-Semitism. Because across the border, the new German Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, was giving everybody a lesson in how we should deal with Jews. Hitler was forcing Jews to leave Germany, and nobody refused to meet with him. Nobody called him an outlaw. The Polish government signed a non-aggression pact with him in 1934. Polish universities welcomed Goebbels. They welcomed Hans Frank, the German justice minister. Goering would come to Poland to a hunt. This friendly country on the western border was giving a lesson. Providing a seminar in how you should deal with the Jewish question, and many Poles were saying, hey, if they can do it, why can't we? Now, on the one hand, many of Poland's leaders, after Pilsudski died, were not personally anti-Semitic. Josef Beck, the foreign minister, had Jewish friends, but they understood that from the point of view of the interests of the Polish state, what they called racja stanu, it was important, internally and externally, to make a big deal of the Jewish question. So no sooner does Pilsudski die than what do we see? A bill in the Polish Sejm to limit ritual slaughter, to limit kosher slaughter, on the grounds, God, we can't see animals suffer. It's okay for Radziwiłł to go hunting with Goering, that's fine, the animals don't suffer, but God forbid that cows should suffer. Unrest escalated in the universities, and students demanded either numerus nullus, Jews out, or they demanded that Jews be limited, and some demanded Jews be segregated. In an effort to halt this violence, university rectors established so-called ghetto benches, where Jews would sit separately. Jewish students refused to sit, they stood up. And this, of course, caused a lot of anger. There was violence, pshitik, Minsk Mazowiecz, Brzeszcz, pogroms. These pogroms did not claim hundreds of victims, and by later standards, they were relatively mild, but they were shocking to Polish Jewry. Now, the government was very upset by these pogroms. The government did not want them, but the government did endorse a policy of nonviolent economic struggle against the Jews. The Polish Prime Minister in 1936 said, we're against violence, but if you want to boycott Jewish shops, if you want to prefer Polish business, of course, that's all right. This growing anti-Semitism was also exacerbated by the policy of the Catholic Church. In a pastoral letter in 1936, the church said, look, we know that not all Jews are bad, and there are God-fearing Jews, there are Jews who work hard and love their families, but there are all too many Jews who are communists, who purvey pornography, who ruin the morals of youth, and it's okay in your business dealings to prefer your own kind. Now, Poland had not yet reached the point of Nuremberg laws. There was talk of it, but that never happened. Polish Jews never lost their status as citizens. They never lost their right to vote. But the atmosphere was becoming more and more tense in the late 1930s. Now, there's a certain paradox here. One paradox is that at a time when relations between Jews and Poles were reaching a new nadir, more Jews than ever before embraced the Polish language as their first language. Between 60 and 80% of Jewish students were getting a Polish education in Polish schools. 25% of Polish Jews were actually speaking Polish as their first language, and the second generation, in many areas, more than half. You'd had a new daily press in the Polish language for Jews, Nationalism, for example, in Warsaw. Here, Jews read the New York Times and they get their Jewish news in the Jewish Week. It says something about the alienation that acculturated middle-class Jews felt, that they needed their own Polish language Jewish newspaper. But the fact was that never before had so many Jews felt such a bond to the Polish language and to Polish culture. Never before had so many Jews seen themselves as part of Poland. Never before had so many Jews believed that there was this real Poland, this true Poland, that would someday reemerge. In 1938, the Warsaw Jewish Community Council celebrated the 75th anniversary of the uprising of 1863. And one professor said, times are bad, things aren't looking good, but what is great and what is fine and what is noble can never die. Someday it will be reborn. And that was a real hope on the eve of the war. Now, it's interesting that in terms of Jewish responses, Jews didn't have a lot of power to defend themselves. They were only 10% of the population. There was Polish Zionism. Yitzhak Greenbaum tried to bring together all the minorities and leverage Jewish political power that way. That didn't work. The Gutta, the Orthodox Jewish political party, believed in Shah Stil, don't rock the boat, don't make waves. And under Pilsudski that worked, but when Pilsudski died, they were rewarded with the ritual slaughter limitation. Some Jews embraced communism, and the Żydka Komuna, or the Kajk commune, became a staple of Polish anti-Semitism. It still is. The amazing thing about Jewish communists is not how many there were, but how few they were. Given the fact that in the Soviet Union, the universities were open, there were Jewish generals and Jewish admirals in place of the discrimination in Poland. The fact was that by all statistical accounts, and the elections of 1928 give us the best sense of how many Jews supported communism, about 5% voted for communist front organizations. Many communists were Jews, but very, very few Jews were communists. And by the late 1930s, Polish Jewry, especially in the big cities, was turning its support to the Bund, B-U-N-D, the Marxist Democratic Jewish Socialist Party. In the city council elections to Warsaw in 1938, of 20 Jewish seats in the Warsaw City Council, 18 were won by the Bund. The Bund got 62% of the Jewish vote. And this was not because the Jews suddenly became Marxists. One newspaper said, "Die Juden haben gestimmt für den Bund eigentlich zu München." The Jews voted for the Bund on their way to München, on their way to the afternoon prayers. But why did the Bund become so important? Because, first of all, the other strategies hadn't worked. The Bund's idea was Deutschkeit, da, here. Here is our home. Poland is our home. We have a right to live here. We will defend our right to live here. When Hasidim were attacked in the parks, the Bund organized goon squads to defend them. When middle-class students were attacked in the universities, the Bund defended them. The Bund also was the only Jewish party that could tell Polish Jewry, we have an ally among the Polish population. That is the Polish Socialist Party. Relations weren't perfect, but the PPS also fought anti-Semitism. And there were signs that the Peasant Party was beginning to rethink anti-Semitism in the late 30s. And so what the Bund said was to the Jews, the Polish people are not idiots. The Polish people will eventually wake up and see that anti-Semitism is not going to make Poland into a rich country. It's not the way to solve our problems. And then they will turn back to what they should be. So the Bund, on the eve of the war, was by far the most popular Jewish party. The war begins. 100,000 Jewish soldiers fight in the Polish army, and many of them fight very heroically. Just before and during the war, there's a thaw in Polish-Jewish relations. Of all the nationalities in Poland, the Poles know that only the Jews are absolutely loyal to the Polish state. Once the Polish army is crushed, Poland is basically divided into three zones of occupation. The western part is annexed to the Reich. That includes Łódź and Poznan. Then there's the general government, or the rest of German-occupied Poland. And then Poland east of the Bug River is occupied by the Soviets. In this first stage, in many, though not all cities, the Germans set up ghettos. They segregate Jews and Poles. They begin the economic expropriation of Polish Jewry. And they begin, along with the Soviets, on their side, a savage massacre of the Polish intelligentsia. In the very first part of the occupation, in fact, in terms of physical liquidation, the Polish intelligentsia probably suffered more than the Jews in the very beginning. In terms of Polish-Jewish relations, on the one hand, there was a great deal of individual sympathy and help. Polish friends helping Jews. There was massive smuggling, which was for profit, but which also kept Jews alive. 80% of the calories coming into the Warsaw Ghetto were smuggled in. And this couldn't have happened without the cooperation of Poles. Jews who were wandering, looking for food, often got help. On the other hand, as Jews were forced into ghettos, many houses, many businesses, many shops, ipso facto, went into Polish hands. The Polish government in exile, under pressure to show that it was committed to a liberal, decent, democratic Poland, authorized one of its ministers, STAJE, to issue a proclamation saying after the war, everybody will be equal and all property will be returned. And the underground Polish delegate sent a message to the government in exile saying, have you lost your mind? This has made a bad impression. Most Poles do not want the Jews to take back their shops. Most Poles are, in some way or another, anti-Semitic. And Jan Karski, the heroic Polish courier, later wrote that anti-Semitism was indeed the narrow bridge which could link the Poles, who despised the Germans, with the German occupiers. Now, a major factor in Polish perceptions of the Jews was the belief that the Jews had betrayed Poland during the Soviet invasion and occupation. For the Poles, the Germans and the Soviets were equally bad. Katyn, the murder of Polish officers, became widely known only in 1943, but there was plenty of other evidence before then. 1 million people were deported. The Polish intelligentsia, middle class, were deported. So the Poles had no reason to think that the Germans were any worse. For the Jews, on the other hand, the Soviets were certainly preferable to the Germans. And one Jewish leader, Kleinbaum, said, it's like choosing between a life sentence and a death sentence. You'd rather have a life sentence. The Soviets destroyed the Jewish middle class, deported many Jewish businessmen to Siberia. They deported Zionists and Bundists. They shut down religious education and the Hebrew schools. Among the 1 million people deported from Eastern Poland, a very high proportion, out of proportion to their place in the population, were Jewish. Those people survived for the most part. However, the fact remains that if you were a poor Jew in Eastern Poland, if you were a tailor, if you were a shoemaker, if you came from a lower social background in the shtetl, the Soviet occupation wasn't terrible for you. You had a chance to go to school. You felt that you were treated more equally. You felt that you could get a job in the lower administration. Poles looked on, as well as Lithuanians and Ukrainians, and they burned with anger. So we have the perception of collaboration, which wasn't real because the real dirty work was done by non-Jews and by NKVD officers brought in from interior Russia. And I want to add that that perception of collaboration also becomes a big alibi. It becomes an alibi which explains the massive Lithuanian murder of their Jewish neighbors in 1941. It's an alibi which explains the massive Ukrainian collaboration in the killing of Jews in 1941. And it's an alibi which assuaged the consciousness of many Poles who would have felt bad about taking over Jewish property or even doing worse, but who could tell themselves that the Jews had it coming because of their betrayal of Poland. Now we come to a new stage in Polish-Jewish relations, the beginning of the mass murder. And this is something which has caused, for obvious reasons, bitterness and anger and mutual recriminations. The Poles say, with reason, with justice, we too were terrorized. We were occupied by a brutal regime. And if we were caught hiding Jews, we suffered the death penalty. And the fact is, we know about 750 Poles who were executed for what the Germans call Judenbegünstigung. And that included the father of a boy who tried to help my mother in 1942. He was shot. So there's no question the Germans were ruthless towards Poles that they found helping Jews. And we should also hearken to the words of Emanuel Ringelblum, Olaf Ashon, who said in his classic work on Polish-Jewish relations during the Second World War, which has not lost much of its validity, even though it was written in a bunker in Warsaw by a flickering light in 1943-44. He said, we have to remind ourselves that it was the Germans and not the Poles who did the Holocaust. That the Germans were so obsessed and so determined to kill the Jews that even had the Poles had a different attitude, it's not clear that the end result would have been very different. More individuals would have been saved. He was writing this in 43-44. The Germans were determined to kill all the Jews. Ringelblum also rejected the idea that he felt all too many Jews believed, that all Poles were happy that they were being killed. And he underscored the risk that Poles took in helping Jews. But he too, in the end, came to very negative conclusions about the Polish underground state, about the Polish underground army. He said, why was it that if the Germans are running after a fleeing Polish resistance fighter and through the streets of Warsaw, all they have to do is yell, "Catch the Jew," and some Pole is going to help them catch the fleeing fighter. Ringelblum underscored that while it was socially acceptable and even praiseworthy for Poles to belong to the patriotic underground, it was socially unacceptable, and it was even stigmatized to be seen as someone who was helping Jews. And Poles had more to fear from their own neighbors than they had to fear from the Germans. Now, there's a puzzling fact, and the latest research underscores this puzzling fact. There's a terrific scholar in Israel called Havi Dreyfus, who's written a book. She says, you know, until 1942, the Jewish attitude towards the Poles as a nation was basically okay. It was positive. And the real shift towards hatred and bitterness came only with the beginning of the mass killing. And we see the same in Ringelblum. During the war, he's saying, if we look at the archive, we see a lot of mixed evidence, a lot of damning evidence about the Poles, but also a lot of positive evidence about Polish-Jewish relations. Abraham Lewin, another major leader of the Onyx Shabbos archive, the underground archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, writes in June 1942 that Polish-Jewish relations have taken a positive turn. But everybody agrees that when the mass murder begins, instead of bringing Poles and Jews together, it leads to a worsening. Now, why does this happen? I want to read to you something written in 1942 by a Polish writer, Zofia Kosakszewska, who, by the way, on the one hand, was an anti-Semite, quote unquote. She felt Jews were alien and harmful to Poland. On the other hand, she helped organize Gutta, the council to help Jews, and she played a major role in saving Jews. She writes in 1942, and listen carefully, this is interesting. At first, the behavior of the peasantry in the face of German atrocities against the Jews was humane, logical, and reasonable. It was expressed in a Christian willingness to help hungry Jews who were leaving the ghettos. And that's true. That was still the case in 1941. However, by the second half of 1942, after the beginning of the mass murder, these attitudes have changed radically. Today, German bestiality has dulled the moral sensibilities of the peasantry, has undermined the moral instincts. Thunder does not strike from the sky to slay the killers of children. Blood does not cry for vengeance. Perhaps the peasants think it is true that the Jew is damned, that someone can kill them without fear of punishment. Therefore, there are more and more cases of active collaboration on the part of the peasantry in the German murder of Jews. This is a very dangerous precedent. Now, a major factor in this escalating bitterness was the Jewish perception, which was true, that in the eyes of the Polish Home Army and in the eyes of the Polish underground government, the Jews were outside their sphere of moral responsibility. They're aliens, they're strangers. We don't care about them. We care about our own people. If the Germans are going to start deporting our own people, as the leader of the Home Army said, then we fight. Damn the odds, we will fight. But since it was the Jews who were not allowed into the Polish underground, it's happening to others. It doesn't concern us. Now, there are reasons, you can understand why. Poland was facing an existential crisis. The Poles knew that if they were going to be liberated by the Germans, the only probable liberator was going to be who? The Red Army, which was, you know, just as bad. The Poles had their own worries. It's true. But the fact is that as these worries dominated their policy, the Jews were simply secondary. They were not part of the equation. Now, the Polish Home Army was a big organization, and it had a lot of different people. There were individuals who really cared about Jews. People like the editor of the Bulletin Informacyjny, the main propaganda organ of the Home Army, Alexander Kamiński, the liaison between the Home Army and the Jewish fighters, Henryk Waliński, did his best to help Jews. But on the whole, the record of the Polish Home Army towards the Jews is a very negative one. Many cases of rampant anti-Semitism, of Jews hiding in the forests, being killed, a lack of empathy. A Jew who's hiding in the Polish countryside is going to steal food if he can't get a peasant to give it to him, to stay alive. In 1943, the commander of the Home Army condemns these bandits, who are often Jews, who are terrorizing and robbing the Polish peasants, giving the green light for the Home Army to hunt them down. That, in effect, helps put the Jews in the crosshairs of the Polish underground. On the one hand, the Polish Home Army showed contempt for Jews because allegedly they were cowards and didn't fight, and their passivity brought their fate on themselves. And then on the other hand, when the Jewish fighters turned to the Home Army for weapons, the weapons were given stingily and with great reluctance. A little change for the better after January 43, but not much. Now, one of the bright spots in the history of the Polish underground state, and I said the Polish underground was a very diverse organization, so you can't paint it with the same brush. And then there was the NSZ, the nationalist underground. That's a different story. But one of the bright spots was the formation of an organization called Gutta, the Council to Help Jews. The Provisional Committee to Help Jews was formed in September 1942, mainly by Catholic activists. That included Zofia Kossak, that included Władysław Bartoszewski, who later became a foreign minister of Poland. Some of these Catholics had been ideologically anti-Jewish, but who believed, like Zofia Kossak, that as Catholics, as Christians, we cannot stand by and watch this enormous crime take place and simply pretend it doesn't concern us. We have a religious obligation to act. And so the initial catalyst for the formation of Gutta came from committed Catholics. And very soon, for reasons that are complicated, I don't want to get into, some of these Catholics left the organization. The organization was renamed Gutta in late 1942, and it was unique in many ways. On the one hand, it bore the imprimatur of the delegatura. It bore the imprimatur of the Polish government. It wasn't just an independent organization. It included representatives of some of the Polish political parties, the Socialists and the Peasant Party and the Democratic Party. And they sat together with two Jewish representatives, Adolf Berman and Leon Feiner. And Gutta included some of the finest and some of the most noble Polish individuals, like Irena Sendlerowa, who saved many children, like Jan Żabiński, who ran the Warsaw Zoo and who sheltered many, many, many Jews. Gutta was active mainly in Warsaw, to some degree in Kraków. What did it do? It gave monthly subsidies of 500 zlotys, not a lot, but it was a sign of moral solidarity. It helped to save children. Very important was its ability to forge documents, which helped to save many Jewish lives. It provided doctors and medicine. Gutta did not have an easy time within the Polish underground. For example, Gutta kept on complaining that it was not getting enough money from the Polish underground. Gutta was also complaining that the Polish underground was not cracking down on the blackmailers who were making a fortune blackmailing Jews trying to hide on the Aryan side. They demanded death penalties and publication of death penalties and a no-nonsense declaration to the Polish people that blackmailing and the killing of Polish citizens is a crime against Poland. That never really happened. Yes, a few blackmailers were executed by the Polish underground, but with some exceptions, most of those who were executed not because they blackmailed Jews, but because they also blackmailed Poles. So I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to cut the rest of what I say short. I want to end by saying this. In Poland today, we now have a new wave of scholarship. The publication of Jan Gross's Jedwabne, Neighbors, about the massacre in Jedwabne was a great turning point. Because until that point, many Poles could say, like Jan Błoński, you know, we made the Jews feel like strangers and like aliens, and we made them live in the cellar of our house. But as Jan Błoński said in 1987, at least thank God we didn't kill them. Not like the Lithuanians or the Ukrainians. Jan Gross's scholarship forced a revision of that comforting myth. In Jedwabne, Poles did kill their Jewish neighbors. But then people could say that was an exception. It didn't happen that often. And I myself, when I gave a very favorable review to Gross's book in the foreword in 2003, said that compared to the Ukraine or to Lithuania, the Poles still had a somewhat better record. But now we have new scholarship, and I've just written an article about this in the last edition of Yad Vashem Studies by Basia Egelking and Jan Grabowski, Alina Skibinski, and others about what was happening in the countryside. Now, most Jews and most Poles didn't live in Warsaw. They lived in the countryside. And according to Basia Egelking, about 100,000 to 150,000 Jews tried to escape deportations. They tried to hide, they jumped off trains, they wandered the countryside. Very, very few of them survived to the end of the war. The damning expose of this new scholarship is very, very painful. It's much more painful to read than Jan Gross, because what it's saying is, look, I have to cut this short. Look, if I'm a Polish peasant and a Jew knocks on my door in the middle of the night, you can't condemn me for saying I'm not going to hide you. I'm not going to endanger my family. That's human. People are not born to be heroes, right? And you know, you give the person bread, you give them milk, and you send them on their way. That's normal human behavior, and we can't condemn it. But what this scholarship is showing is not a natural human fear for one's own family and a reluctance to be a hero. What this shows is that, especially in 43 and 44, Polish peasants and the Polish police are going out of their way to hunt down Jews, to go into the forests, to find Jews in hiding, and to hunt them down. That where there's no German for miles, the Polish police kill. Where no German is looking down their throats, they still murder Jews. This is a very, very painful chapter, which is only now being investigated. And this has led to a lot of controversy in Poland and the Polish press. I have it on, maybe Kostek knows more about this than I do, but I believe that Jan Grabowski, who was supposed to head the Jewish Museum, one reason that he's not is because of this anger at his book called Judenjagd. But this shows that there are many painful elements of this Polish-Jewish story that are still being explored. There are Polish historians who question their methodology, who question their conclusions. And so this is a chapter that's being continued even as we speak. Okay, thank you.